They say the Arizona Territory in 1878 was a land of harsh sun and even harsher men. It was a place where a life could be bought with a bag of gold, and a soul could be sold for a promise of security. For Miss Eleanor Vance, arriving from the civilized East, her soul was the price for her family's salvation, and the man she was about to marry, Josiah Blackwood, was the devil holding the deed. The church bells tolled, the bride was veiled, and the groom was waiting. But no one in the dusty town of Redemption Gulch could have predicted the shadow that would fall through the doorway, a man bigger than any legend, a ghost from the mountains, an Apache warrior who would change everything with 7 impossible words before committing the most unthinkable act. The dust of Redemption Gulch was a fine red powder that coated everything, the raw lumber of the storefronts, the drooping leaves of the lone cottonwood tree, and the pristine lace of Eleanor Vance's wedding dress. It was a dust born of the unforgiving Sonoran desert, a constant reminder that this place was not Boston. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and genteel society she had been ripped from. Eleanor stood before the warped mirror in her room at the Grand Hotel, a name far too ostentatious for the 2-story clapboard structure that served as the town's finest accommodation. The room was stifling the late August heat, pressing in from all sides. Her reflection showed a woman she barely recognized. The face was hers, pale skin, wide blue eyes that now held a haunted, resigned look, and auburn hair pinned in an elaborate coif. But the woman in the mirror was a sacrifice. Her father, a shipping magnate named William Vance, had made a series of disastrous investments. The Panic of '73 had finally caught up to them, and the Vance family name was on the verge of becoming a cautionary tale whispered in Boston's elite circles. Then came the offer delivered by telegraph from a man named Josiah Blackwood. He was a silver baron, the undisputed king of Redemption Gulch. He had heard of the Vances' plight, and more specifically, of their beautiful unmarried daughter. His proposal was crude in its simplicity. He would absorb all of William Vance's debts, restoring the family to solvency. In return, Eleanor would travel west and become his wife. Josiah Blackwood was a man carved from the same harsh rock as the mountains he plundered. He was handsome in a severe way, with a sharp jaw, jet-black hair, slicked back with macassar oil, and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and empty. He had shown Eleanor the 2-story Victorian house he'd had built on a rise overlooking the town, its white paint a stark defiance against the red earth. He called it the Manor. The townsfolk called it Blackwood's Folly. Eleanor called it her cage. "It is a palace for my queen," he had told her on their first and only walk together, his hand gripping her elbow with a proprietary firmness that made her skin crawl. He didn't ask her about her life, her love of poetry, or her skill with watercolors. He simply informed her of the life she would lead. She would host his business associates. She would manage his household staff. She would be the jewel on his arm, the ultimate symbol of his success, an Eastern-bred lady polished and perfect to legitimize his rugged fortune. Now, on her wedding day, the reality of her bargain settled upon her like a shroud. A knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Gable, the hotel owner's wife, a stout woman with a kind but weary face. "It's time, dearie," she said softly. "The Reverend is ready. Mr. Blackwood is waiting at the church." Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath, the whalebone corset biting into her ribs. It felt appropriate, this feeling of being slowly suffocated. She nodded her throat too tight for words. As she walked down the hotel's creaking staircase, the lobby fell silent. Miners in dusty clothes and shopkeepers in their Sunday best stopped their conversations to stare. She felt like a prized filly being led to auction. The church was a small, sun-bleached building at the end of the main street. Its steeple seemed to strain towards a heaven that felt impossibly far away. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine wood and the nervous sweat of the assembled guests. Josiah stood at the altar looking impeccable in a black frock coat. He turned as she entered, and a triumphant smirk touched his lips. It was not the look of a loving groom, but of a collector who had just acquired his most coveted piece. Sheriff Brody, a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for by Blackwood silver, stood as the best man. Reverend Michael Abernathy, a young, nervous man, fresh from a seminary in Ohio, fumbled with his Bible. Eleanor walked the aisle on the arm of the town's mayor, a man who also happened to be the president of Blackwood's bank. Every step was a final, leaden footfall towards the end of her life, as she knew it. She reached the altar and Josiah took her hand. His skin was dry and cold. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice trembling slightly, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man, Josiah Blackwood, and this woman, Eleanor Vance, in holy matrimony." The words washed over Eleanor, a meaningless drone. She stared at a crack in the wooden floor, focusing on it, praying it might open up and swallow her whole. The heat was becoming unbearable. A fly buzzed lazily near the stained glass window, a lone splash of color in the drab room. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. A heavy expectant silence filled the church. It was a formality, nothing more. Who in this town would dare to defy Josiah Blackwood? The silence stretched on for a moment too long. A nervous cough broke the stillness, and then the doors of the church, which had been propped open to catch any hint of a breeze, were filled by a single colossal shadow. The light from the blazing afternoon sun was suddenly blotted out. Every head in the church turned. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Standing in the doorway was a man who seemed to defy the very proportions of nature. He was immense, well over 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his simple buckskin shirt. His frame was not just tall, but wide and thick with the kind of hard, dense muscle built by a life lived in the mountains. He was Apache, as that much was clear from his high cheekbones, the proud aquiline nose, and the long, unbound black hair that fell past his shoulders, streaked here and there with a touch of grey. His skin was the colour of burnished copper, weathered and creased by sun and wind. A long, jagged scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek, pulling at the corner of his mouth and giving him a permanent grim expression. But it was his eyes that held the congregation captive. They were dark and deep-set, and in their depths burned an intelligence and a profound loneliness that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. He carried no rifle, but a large bowie knife was sheathed at his belt. He didn't move with aggression, but with a quiet, deliberate calm that was somehow more menacing than any overt threat. He simply stood there, his presence sucking all the air and noise from the room. Reverend Abernathy's words died in his throat. Josiah Blackwood turned his face, contorting into a mask of pure fury. "What in God's name is this?" Blackwood snarled his voice, cutting through the stunned silence. "Sheriff, remove this filth from my church." Sheriff Brody, a man usually quick to do Blackwood's bidding, hesitated. He had seen this man before, or rather heard of him. The prospectors and trappers called him Taza. Not a name given by any tribe, but a word whispered in fear. They said he was a ghost, the last of a Chiricahua band, wiped out years ago in a forgotten massacre. They said he lived alone in the Dragoon Mountains, a giant of a man who hunted bear with a knife and spoke to no one. A legend, a myth. But the man in the doorway was terrifyingly real. The giant Apache Taza ignored Blackwood. His gaze swept over the fearful faces of the townsfolk before finally settling on Eleanor. She stood frozen at the altar, her white dress a stark contrast to the dark, imposing figure in the doorway. Their eyes met across the length of the church. Eleanor felt a strange jolt, a current of recognition that made no sense. In his eyes, she didn't see the savagery the others feared. She saw a pain that mirrored her own, the profound ache of utter isolation. Taza took a step forward, his worn moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. Then another. Each step was measured, powerful, and inexorable. Two of Blackwood's mining foremen, brutish men, named Jeb and Carson, rose from the front pew, their hands moving towards the pistols on their hips. "I wouldn't," Taza said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep within the earth. It was the first time most people in the room had ever heard him speak, and the sound alone was enough to freeze the two foremen in place. He continued his slow walk up the aisle, his gaze never leaving Eleanor. The townspeople shrank back into their pews as he passed, as if his very proximity might be deadly. He walked past the armed foremen, as if they were children. He walked past Sheriff Brody, whose hand hovered uselessly over the butt of his Colt. He stopped directly in front of the altar, standing a mere 5 feet from Eleanor Josiah and the trembling Reverend. He was even bigger up close. He smelled of pine leather and the clean, crisp air of the high country. He dwarfed Josiah Blackwood, making the powerful Silver Baron look like a petulant boy. Blackwood, his face purple with rage, finally found his voice. "You have 1 second to leave this church, you heathen savage, before I have you shot where you stand." Taza finally broke his gaze from Eleanor and turned his head slowly to look at Blackwood. He didn't seem angry or afraid. He seemed analytical, as if studying an insect. He looked at Blackwood's expensive suit, his manicured hands, and the cruel twist of his lips. Then his eyes flickered back to Eleanor, to the terror and desperation warring in her face. He took a final step forward, placing himself between Eleanor and her intended groom. He looked down at her, his immense height forcing her to crane her neck. A strange, almost sad expression softened the harsh lines of his face. He seemed to see past the expensive dress and the veil deep into the heart of the caged woman beneath. Then he spoke again, his voice low and raspy, yet carrying to every corner of the silent church. The words were simple, bizarre, and utterly world-shattering. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. The statement hung in the hot, still air, thick with disbelief. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a boast. It was a declaration of fact, delivered with the raw weight of a decade of solitude. It was the loneliest sound Eleanor had ever heard. Before anyone could process the meaning of his words, before Blackwood could scream another order, or the sheriff could draw his gun, Taza moved. It was a movement of shocking speed and grace for a man his size. He reached out a large, calloused hand, not to harm her, but to gently lift her chin. His touch was surprisingly soft, the pad of his thumb rough against her skin. For a heartbeat, he just looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The world narrowed to the space between them. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mingled with a disorienting sense of calm. The profound loneliness in his eyes was a mirror, and she felt an impossible connection to this terrifying stranger. Then he leaned down. He kissed her. It was not a brutal or savage kiss. It was firm and absolute, and tasted of wild things of wood smoke and mint, and a longing so deep it was bottomless. His lips were chapped and warm. It was over in a second, a brief, world-altering pressure against her own. But in that second everything changed. He had not stolen a kiss. He had made a claim. He had branded her, marked her, and severed the final thread of the life she was about to accept. The church erupted. It was as if a bolt of lightning had struck the steeple. Women screamed. Men shouted, leaping to their feet. Reverend Abernathy dropped his Bible with a loud thud. Josiah Blackwood let out a roar of pure, unadulterated fury. "You filthy animal!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with rage. He lunged at Taza, his fists flailing. Taza didn't even seem to notice. He had already straightened up, placing himself fully in front of Eleanor, shielding her with his body as he turned to face the room. Blackwood's punch landed on Taza's broad back, with all the effect of a child hitting a stone wall. Taza didn't flinch. He simply reached back without looking, seized the front of Blackwood's coat, and with a flick of his wrist sent the smaller man tumbling back against the altar, where he collapsed in an undignified heap. "Sheriff, shoot him, goddammit, shoot him!" Blackwood bellowed from the floor. Sheriff Brodie finally drew his Colt peacemaker, the click of the hammer being cocked, echoing unnaturally in the chaos. "Hold it right there, Taza. Just hold it!" he yelled, his voice unsteady. Taza slowly turned his head to face the sheriff, his expression unreadable. He held his empty hands out to his sides, a gesture of peace that was utterly contradicted by the raw power he radiated. "This woman is not for him," Taza stated, his voice calm and steady. "She does not have the eyes of a bride. She has the eyes of a prisoner." Eleanor, standing behind him, felt a tremor run through her. He had seen it. In one glance, this stranger from the mountains had seen the truth she had been hiding from everyone, even herself. "That is none of your damn business," Sheriff Brodie countered, trying to sound authoritative. "She is here to marry Mr. Blackwood. You will leave now, or I will put a bullet in you." Taza shook his head slowly. "The people have old ways. When a great injustice is seen, a man can make a claim. A challenge. I claim this woman." "Claim!" Blackwood spat, scrambling to his feet, his face livid. "This isn't some savage camp. This is a town of laws. My laws. She is my property." The word property struck Eleanor like a physical blow. In that moment, all the veiled threats, the proprietary glances, and the cold calculations of her union with Josiah were laid bare. He didn't see a wife. He saw an acquisition. Taza's eyes narrowed at Blackwood's outburst. "A person is not property." He said the words low and dangerous. He then turned his head slightly, his voice directed at Eleanor, though he did not look at her. "He offers you a cage. I offer you the sky. The choice is yours." The entire church was frozen in a tense tableau. Every eye was on Eleanor, Blackwood sputtering with rage, the sheriff, his gun wavering, and the giant Apache who stood before her, a shield and a question. A cage or the sky? The devil she knew, a life of comfortable misery, or the terrifying unknown freedom offered by a wild man who had just kissed her in front of the entire town. Her father's face flashed in her mind, the shame he would feel, the ruin she was supposed to prevent. But then she saw her own future in Blackwood's eyes, years of silent obedience of being paraded, and possessed her spirit, slowly withering until nothing was left. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and a wild, exhilarating hope. Sheriff Brodie took a step forward. "Miss Vance, step away from him. We'll handle this." "Stay where you are," Blackwood commanded, pointing a trembling finger at her. "Eleanor, you are my wife." "Not yet she ain't," a grizzled prospector mumbled from the back. The choice is yours." The words echoed in her soul. She looked at Tarza's broad, buckskin-clad back. It was a wall, a mountain, an entire wilderness standing between her and Josiah Blackwood. It was the most frightening and the safest she had ever felt. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Eleanor Vance, the well-bred lady from Boston, made a decision that would forever alter the course of her life and become a legend in the Arizona Territory. She took a small step forward, and then another, until she was standing so close to Tarza that her white dress brushed against his leather leggings. She reached out a trembling hand and placed it on his arm. The muscle beneath her palm was as hard as oak. "I will go with him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Yet it carried the force of a thunderclap in the silent church. The moment the words left her lips, the fragile truce shattered. "No." Blackwood's scream was animalistic. He shoved the Reverend aside and lunged again, but this time he wasn't aiming for Tarza. He was aiming for her. He grabbed Eleanor's arm, his fingers digging into her bicep like claws. "You are mine. I paid for you." Tarza reacted instantly. He didn't strike Blackwood. He simply moved between them and used his massive chest to force Blackwood back, breaking his grip on Eleanor. At the same time, he swept his own powerful arm around Eleanor's waist, pulling her securely behind him. The gesture was possessive, but it felt entirely different from Blackwood's grasp. It was protective. "Sheriff, do your damn job!" Blackwood raged. Sheriff Brody was trapped. His entire position, his salary, his comfortable life depended on Josiah Blackwood. But to shoot a man in the back, an unarmed man who had been chosen by the bride herself, was a line even he was hesitant to cross, especially with 50 witnesses watching. "Tarza, this is your last chance," the sheriff warned, his face pale and sweating. "Let the woman go." "She has chosen," Tarza said, simply beginning to back away towards the church doors, pulling Eleanor with him. His movements were fluid and economical, his eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing every threat. Blackwood's two foremen, Jeb and Carson, finally acted. Seeing the sheriff's hesitation, they drew their own pistols. "Don't let him leave, Sheriff!" Jeb shouted. The sight of the 2 extra guns galvanized the lawman. Brody steadied his aim. "Don't make me do this, Tarza." Tarza stopped. He was still 10 yards from the exit. He was trapped. Eleanor's heart sank. Her one act of defiance was going to get them both killed. She could feel the tension in the arm that held her. He was a coiled spring, ready to fight, ready to die. And then something shifted. It wasn't in Tarza. It was in her. The terror that had been her constant companion for months was suddenly burned away by a flare of righteous anger. Anger at Blackwood for buying her. Anger at her father for selling her. Anger at a world that gave her no choice but to be a commodity. Tarza had given her a choice, and she would not let them take it away. "Stop!" Eleanor's voice, clear and commanding, rang out through the church. It was the voice of a Boston matriarch, a voice accustomed to being obeyed, and it startled everyone, including Tarza. She gently pushed herself out from behind him, so she was standing beside him, facing the guns. Her wedding veil was askew, her hair coming undone, but her chin was held high. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a woman who had made her stand. "Sheriff Brody," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "You asked Mr. Tarza to let me go. I am not being held. I am going with him of my own free will." The sheriff blinked, momentarily confused. "Ma'am, you don't understand. This man is a savage. He's dangerous." "The only danger I have faced in this town," Eleanor declared, her eyes locking with Josiah Blackwood's, "was standing at this altar. Mr. Blackwood just referred to me as property he had paid for." Is that the law in this town, Sheriff, that a woman is no different from a sack of flour or a mule? A murmur went through the crowd. The women in particular straightened in their pews. They knew the harsh realities of this land, but her words struck a chord of truth that was hard to ignore. Blackwood's face was a thundercloud. "Eleanor, be silent. You are hysterical." "I am not hysterical. I am for the first time seeing things clearly," she retorted. She then turned her gaze back to the sheriff. "If you shoot this man, you will be shooting an unarmed man who is protecting me at my request from a man I do not wish to marry. Is that how you uphold the law here?" Sheriff Brody was flummoxed. He was a simple man, used to dealing with drunks and claim jumpers. This drawing-room debate held at gunpoint was beyond him. He lowered his pistol an inch, his resolve wavering. Taza used the moment of hesitation. Without a word, he swooped down, hooked his arm under Eleanor's knees, and lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Before she could even gasp, he was moving. He turned and strode for the door, his long legs eating up the distance in a few powerful strides. "Stop him!" Blackwood shrieked, but it was too late. The foremen Jeb and Carson raised their pistols to fire. A single booming gunshot echoed, but it didn't come from them. It came from the back of the church. One of the old prospectors, a man named Silas Whiskey Jones, was standing on a pew, an ancient Colt dragoon clutched in his hand, smoke curling from its barrel. The bullet had splintered the wooden ceiling, raining dust down on everyone. "Next one's for the man who shoots a fella who's just doing what the lady asked." Silas bellowed, his voice raspy from cheap whiskey and a lifetime of shouting over the noise of pickaxes. "Fair's fair." That single act of defiance from an old drunk was all it took. The moment of unified aggression was broken. By the time Brody and the others looked back, Taza and Eleanor were gone, vanished into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. Josiah Blackwood stood amidst the stunned congregation, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. He had been publicly humiliated, robbed. His perfect, priceless acquisition had been stolen from the altar by a wild man. "A posse!" he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "Sheriff, get a posse. I want him hunted down like the dog he is. And I want her back. I don't care what condition you find her in. Just bring her back." The world outside the church was a blur of motion and suffocating heat. Taza moved with a loping, ground-covering stride that seemed impossible for a man his size. He carried Eleanor not with difficulty, but with a focused purpose, his powerful arms a cradle of solid muscle. The fine fabric of her wedding dress was snagged on chaparral and stained with the red dust of the street as he bypassed the main road and cut through the alleyways behind the saloon and the blacksmith's shop. Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. "Where are you taking me? Put me down," she demanded, her voice muffled against his buckskin shirt. He didn't answer. He didn't even break stride. His focus was absolute escape. They reached the edge of town where the makeshift buildings gave way to the endless expanse of the desert, dotted with saguaro cacti that stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels. Hidden in a small arroyo tied to a scrubby mesquite tree was a magnificent horse. It was a massive buckskin Mustang, nearly as powerfully built as its owner, with a wild, intelligent eye. With a single fluid motion, Taza swung her up and onto the horse's back, seating her in front of the simple leather pad that served as a saddle. He untied the reins and vaulted up behind her, his large frame encompassing hers completely. His left arm circled her waist, holding her securely against his chest, while his right hand took the reins. With a soft cluck of his tongue, he urged the horse forward, and the animal exploded into a gallop. The jarring motion, the raw speed, the feeling of his hard body pressed against her back, it was overwhelming. The town of Redemption Gulch shrank behind them with alarming speed, becoming a dusty smudge on the horizon. Taza guided the horse not into the open desert, but towards the jagged, blue, hazy peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. For the first hour, they rode in silence, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of hooves and the whistle of the wind. Eleanor's initial panic began to subside, replaced by a dawning, terrifying awareness of her situation. She had escaped Josiah Blackwood, but she had thrown her lot in with a complete stranger, a man considered a savage, and was now being carried deeper and deeper into a wilderness she could not possibly survive on her own. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, Taza finally slowed the horse to a walk. He guided them into a narrow canyon where the rock walls rose high on either side, offering concealment and shade. He dismounted and then gently lifted her down, her legs unaccustomed to riding nearly buckled beneath her. "We rest here," he said, his voice a low rumble. He tended to the horse, first rubbing it down with handfuls of dry grass and allowing it to drink from a small canteen. His movements were efficient and filled with a quiet reverence for the animal. Only when the horse was cared for did he turn his attention to her. Eleanor stood awkwardly in her ruined wedding dress, a pale, ridiculous ghost in this primal landscape. She was thirsty, exhausted, and utterly terrified. Taza seemed to sense her distress. He pulled a second canteen from his saddle and handed it to her. "Water." She drank greedily. The water was warm but life-giving. He then unstrapped a small leather pouch from his belt and produced a piece of jerky and a handful of dried berries, offering them to her. She shook her head, her stomach too knotted with fear to eat. He did not insist, simply taking a small portion for himself. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice raspy. "Why did you do that?" He chewed his food slowly before answering, his dark eyes studying the canyon walls as if reading a map. "I told you. I saw your eyes. You saw my eyes." She repeated the answer, feeling maddeningly insufficient. "You ruined my life. You may have gotten us both killed because you saw my eyes." He turned to look at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made her take an involuntary step back. "Your life was already ruined," he said, his voice flat and certain. "You were walking to your own funeral. A slow death is still a death. I offered you a different path." "A path to where?" she cried, gesturing at the hostile alien landscape around them. "To die of thirst in this desert, to be hunted down by that man's posse. The mountains will provide. The posse will be dealt with," he said, with an unshakable confidence that was both frightening and strangely reassuring. Night fell quickly in the canyon, the oppressive heat of the day giving way to a surprising chill. Taza built a small, smokeless fire in a pit using dry wood that seemed to appear from nowhere. The flames cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, making him look even larger and more elemental. He unrolled a thick buffalo hide from behind his saddle and laid it near the fire for her. "Sleep," he commanded softly. Eleanor hesitated. Sleep next to this man. But the alternative was to sit awake all night, cold and terrified, exhaustion won out. She lay down on the hide, pulling the ruined silk of her dress around her. It offered little warmth. She found herself shivering as much from cold as from fear. Taza, who had been sitting cross-legged on the other side of the fire, staring into the flames, seemed to notice. After a moment, he rose and came over to her. She flinched as he knelt beside her, but he made no move to touch her. Instead, he took a heavy wool blanket that had been part of his saddle roll and gently draped it over her. "The night mountains are cold for those not used to them," he said. His voice was softer now. He returned to his side of the fire, wrapping himself in his own blanket and leaning back against the rock wall. He closed his eyes, but Eleanor knew he was not truly asleep. He was listening, sensing the wilderness around them. For the first time in months, she was not in a soft bed. She was on the hard ground, a fugitive with a strange Apache warrior as her only protector. And yet, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she couldn't escape a startling realization. She felt safer here, under a blanket of stars, with a near-silent stranger than she ever had in Josiah Blackwood's gilded manor. The journey continued for 3 more days. Taza pushed them hard, moving through terrain that seemed impassable. He led them up rocky slopes, through narrow crevices, and across plateaus that offered breathtaking views of the vast, empty land. He moved with the land a part of it, while Eleanor felt like a clumsy intruder. Her fancy shoes were destroyed on the first day, and Taza, without comment, cut sections from his spare blanket and helped her wrap her feet. Her dress was shredded, and she finally tore the long skirt off at the knees to make walking easier. She was being stripped of every last vestige of her old life layer by layer. He taught her through actions more than words. He showed her which plants held water, how to read tracks in the dust, and how to stay silent and listen to the language of the wind and the birds. She learned that his silence was not one of ignorance, but of observation. He was constantly aware, his senses attuned to their surroundings in a way she couldn't comprehend. On the 3rd night, they made camp in a high, hidden valley, with a spring-fed pool and lush grass for the horse. The moon was full, illuminating the landscape in a soft, silver light. After a meal of roasted rabbit he had caught with a simple snare, Eleanor found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. "You said you hadn't seen a woman in 10 years. Is that true?" Taza stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes. He was silent for a long time before he spoke. "It is true," he said. 10 years ago, my family, my band, we were camped by the Gila River. We thought we had a treaty. We thought we were safe." His voice grew thick with a pain so old and deep it was almost physical. "Soldiers came. Not all soldiers are bad men. But these men were led by a man who enjoyed killing. They came at dawn." He fell silent again, and Eleanor didn't dare speak, knowing she was treading on sacred, sorrowful ground. "I was young and very large even then. I fought, I killed many. But there were too many. I was wounded, left for dead." He unconsciously touched the long scar on his face. "When I woke, everyone was gone. My wife, my small daughter, my mother, all of them." He looked up from the fire and met her eyes. "She was the last woman I saw. My wife lying in the dust. 10 years ago." The story fell into the space between them, a weight of unimaginable grief. Eleanor finally understood. The loneliness, the pain in his eyes, his bizarre declaration in the church, hadn't been about desire. It had been about a wound, a decade-long exile from the human race. The man who led the soldiers, Taza continued his voice, now a low, dangerous growl. He had cold eyes, like the man at the altar. When I saw him look at you with that same look of ownership, of a thing to be used and discarded, I saw the same spirit, and I would not let it happen again. In that moment, he was no longer a savage, a stranger, or a kidnapper. He was Taza, a man who had lost everything and had stepped out of his lonely world to save her from a fate he understood all too well. A profound, aching empathy filled her heart. Without thinking, she reached across the small fire and laid her hand on his. He didn't pull away. His hand, calloused and scarred, slowly turned and enclosed hers, his grip gentle but firm. They sat that way for a long time, two fugitives under the silver moon, their shared silence, a language more intimate than any words. Josiah Blackwood was not a patient man. While Taza and Eleanor were forging a fragile bond in the high mountains, Blackwood was tearing Redemption Gulch apart with his rage. He offered a bounty that made even the most hardened men's eyes widen, $500 in gold for the return of Eleanor, and another $500 for Taza, dead or alive. The posse he assembled was not a disciplined force of lawmen. It was a motley collection of his most ruthless mine foremen, opportunistic bounty hunters who had drifted into town on the scent of easy money, and a few cowboys looking for a payday and some violent excitement. Sheriff Brody was nominally in charge, but everyone knew the real leader was Blackwood himself, his face a mask of obsessive fury riding a fine black stallion and armed with a brand-new Winchester rifle. They were not trackers, not like Taza. They were crushers. They followed the obvious trail, left by the galloping horse, their numbers and noise scaring off any wildlife for miles. But Taza had anticipated this. On the second day, he led them to a rocky plateau where the ground was like iron, leaving almost no tracks. There he had dismounted, tied strips of leather around his horse's hooves to muffle their sound, and led them on a winding, deceptive path that would have confounded even a seasoned Apache scout. Blackwood's posse, however, had one advantage, a scout named a real-life name, Ben Kitteridge. Kitteridge was a wiry, sun-scorched man who had spent years as an army scout and had a reputation for being able to track a ghost across slick rock. He was a bitter man who hated all Apaches with a venomous passion stemming from a raid that had cost him his family years ago. For Kitteridge, this wasn't about money. It was personal. For days, a deadly game of cat and mouse unfolded across the Dragoon Range. Taza was the mouse, but a mouse who knew every crack and crevice in the wall. He used the terrain with masterful skill, doubling back on his own trail, leading them into dead-end box canyons, and using ridges and high passes to observe their progress from miles away. Eleanor was no longer a passenger. She was a partner. Her senses, sharpened by days in the wild, began to pick up on the subtle signs Taza had taught her. The agitated call of a jay that signaled men approaching, the unnatural stillness in a valley. She learned to ride, clinging low to the horse's neck, to move silently through the brush, to endure hunger and thirst without complaint. The pampered lady from Boston was gone, burned away by the desert sun, and reforged into something harder, more resilient. One afternoon, as they rested in a thicket of manzanita on a high ridge, Taza pointed down into the valley below. The posse was visible, a line of dark figures crawling across the landscape. Kitteridge, Taza said, his voice grim. Ben Kitteridge is with them. He reads the land well. Eleanor watched the distant figures, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Can we outrun them? In the mountains, speed is not as important as patience, Taza replied. They are loud, they are angry, they will make mistakes. We will wait. The bond between them deepened with every shared danger, every silent meal, every quiet look across a campfire. The physical intimacy of their flight, sharing a horse, the warmth of his body shielding hers from the night wind, forged a connection that was both primal and profound. She began to see the man behind the giant's frame and the grim scar. She saw the gentleness in the way he treated his horse, the deep sadness that sometimes surfaced in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, and the fierce, unwavering protectiveness he showed towards her. One evening, a sudden summer storm broke over the mountains. Lightning spider-webbed across the sky, and rain came down in blinding sheets. Taza led them to a shallow cave he knew of a small overhang on the side of a cliff. They were soaked and shivering, the fire sputtering weakly against the damp. Huddled together for warmth under the single wool blanket, the proximity was electric. Eleanor was acutely aware of the strength in the arm that was draped over her shoulders, the steady rhythm of his breathing. The fear she had once felt was long gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling attraction. "Taza," she whispered into the darkness. If they catch us, what will you do?" He was silent for a moment, the only sound the drumming of the rain outside. "I will not be taken," he said finally. The meaning was clear. He would fight to the death. "But they will not catch us. I will get you to safety." "And where is that?" she asked. "Where could we possibly go?" "South," he said. "Across the border. To Sonora. There are others there. Chiricahua who escaped. They live in the Sierra Madre. A new life. A new life." The words resonated within her. A life with him in the wild mountains of Mexico. It was an insane, impossible thought. But the alternative being dragged back to Blackwood was unthinkable. She realized with a startling jolt that she didn't want to be rescued. Her place was here with this man. She shifted, turning to face him in the near darkness of the cave. "And what of my choice?" "Taza in the church, you said it was my choice. Is it still?" He understood her meaning. He looked down at her, his face barely visible in the faint glow of the dying embers. His usual stoicism was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. "Eleanor," he said her name, a soft prayer on his lips. "To be with me is to be hunted, to have nothing, to always be looking over your shoulder. Blackwood offers you wealth, a soft bed, safety. He offers a cage," she whispered, echoing his own words back to him. She reached up and gently touched the scar on his cheek. "This is not nothing, Taza. This is real." He leaned down, slowly giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. This time, when he kissed her, it was not a claim made in defiance. It was a kiss of equals, a desperate, searching kiss, born of shared danger and a blossoming, impossible love. It was a silent vow, made in a storm-swept cave, a promise to face whatever came together. The storm passed, and the next day, Kitteridge found their trail. The game was nearing its end. Taza knew they couldn't run forever. They had to make a stand. He led them towards a place of his own, choosing a narrow, boulder-choked pass known as Apache, Leap, a place of legends, and a place that offered a defender a significant advantage. It was time for the hunted to become the hunter. Apache Leap was a place of stark, brutal beauty. The pass narrowed to a bottleneck barely 20 yards wide, with towering granite cliffs on either side. The ground was a treacherous maze of massive, tumbled boulders, providing endless cover for a defender and a nightmare for an attacker. It was a natural fortress, and it was here that Taza decided their flight would end. "They will follow us in," he explained to Eleanor as he secured his horse in a hidden alcove. "They are too proud to go around. Kitteridge will know this place is a trap, but Blackwood's anger will make him blind." His preparations were meticulous and deadly. He was no longer just a guide. He was a warrior preparing for his final battle. From his saddlebags, he produced not a rifle, but a powerful Apache bow and a quiver of stone-tipped arrows. To Eleanor's surprised look, he explained, "A rifle's smoke gives away your position. An arrow is a silent ghost." He positioned Eleanor deep within a cluster of rocks that was nearly inaccessible with a clear view of the pass, but well out of the line of fire. "You will stay here," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No matter what you hear, you do not move. You do not make a sound." She clutched his arm, her heart pounding. pounding with a cold dread. "Taza, this is suicide. There are more than a dozen of them. One man who knows the land is worth 20 who do not," he said, his eyes filled with a grim calm. He placed his large hand over hers. "I did not bring you this far to fail. I fight for more than my own life now." He gave her hand a final squeeze, and then melted into the rocks, becoming just another shadow in the labyrinth of stone. An hour later, the posse arrived. As Taza predicted, they rode arrogantly into the mouth of the pass. Eleanor could hear Blackwood's voice, sharp and impatient, urging them forward. Kitteridge the scout was visibly uneasy, his head on a constant swivel. The trap was sprung with lethal silence. As the first two riders entered the narrowest part of the pass, two arrows whispered through the air. They struck with sickening thuds, and the men toppled from their saddles without a cry. Confusion erupted. The men behind them reined in their horses, drawing their rifles, eyes scanning the cliffs for the puff of smoke that never came. Another arrow flew, catching a third man in the throat. Panic began to set in. Taza was a phantom, moving unseen through the rocks, striking from a new position each time. His arrows were devastatingly accurate, aimed with a cold, desperate precision. "He's up there. Spread out, flush him out." Blackwood screamed, his voice a mixture of fury and a new, unfamiliar tremor of fear. He dismounted and took cover behind a boulder, firing his Winchester wildly at the cliffs. The battle became a chaotic, brutal affair. The posse used to open fights was at a complete disadvantage in the tight rock-strewn terrain. Taza was everywhere and nowhere at once. He would loose an arrow from one side of the pass, and by the time they returned fire, he would be 50 yards away on the other side, sending another deadly shaft into their ranks. Sheriff Brody, who had been at the rear, saw the unfolding massacre for what it was. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution. His conscience, long buried under Blackwood's silver, finally stirred. He saw his men being picked off one by one in service to one man's bruised ego. Meanwhile, Ben Kitteridge, the only one who posed a real threat, had abandoned the main group. He moved with the quiet skill of a predator, his eyes methodically scanning the rocks, hunting Taza, as Taza hunted the others. Eleanor watched in horrified silence, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. She saw Taza, a fleeting shadow, as he moved across a high ledge. At the same moment, she saw Kitteridge below, raising his rifle, taking careful aim. Taza was exposed. He wouldn't see the scout in time. Without thinking, without weighing the consequences, Eleanor acted. She did the one thing she could do. She screamed, a single piercing shriek that echoed off the canyon walls. The sound startled Kitteridge, making him flinch and spoiling his aim. His shot went wide, the bullet ricocheting off the rock face inches from Taza's head. The sound of the scream, however, also gave away her position. "There! The woman is there!" one of the men yelled. Blackwood's eyes lit up with a malevolent fire. "Get her!" he ordered. "He'll come for her." Taza, now aware of Kitteridge, loosed an arrow that forced the scout back into cover. But he was caught in a terrible dilemma. Protecting Eleanor meant exposing himself. Two of Blackwood's men began scrambling up the rocks towards her hiding place. Taza was pinned down by Kitteridge's accurate fire from one side and the remaining posse members from the other. For the first time, his calm facade broke, and a look of desperation crossed his face. Just as the men were closing in on Eleanor, another gunshot echoed through the pass, but this one came from the entrance. Sheriff Brody stood there, his Colt smoking in his hand. One of the men climbing towards Eleanor cried out and tumbled back down, clutching a wounded leg. "That's enough, Josiah!" The sheriff yelled, his voice carrying surprising authority. "This is over. This isn't law. It's murder." Blackwood spun around his face, contorted in disbelief. "Brody, have you lost your mind? Shoot the savage, not my men. The savage is the one who's been behaving with more honor than you." Brody shot back his gun, now trained on Blackwood. "This ends now." This betrayal from his own paid lawman pushed Blackwood over the edge. He let out a wordless scream of rage and charged not at the sheriff, but up the rocks towards Eleanor himself. "If I can't have you, no one will—" He shrieked, his eyes wild with madness. His reckless charge gave Taza the opening he needed. Kitteridge was momentarily distracted by the standoff between Brody and Blackwood. Taza drew his bow one last time, not aiming at the scout, but at Blackwood. The arrow flew true, striking Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him around, and sending him tumbling down the rocks to land in a heap at the bottom of the pass. He was alive, but broken and defeated. Seeing their paymaster fall and the sheriff turned against them, the remaining members of the posse lost their nerve. They threw down their guns. The battle was over. Kitteridge the scout remained. He and Taza stared at each other from across the rocks, two ancient enemies. But the fight was gone from the scout's eyes. He had been beaten. With a slow, almost respectful nod, Kitteridge lowered his rifle, turned, and walked away, disappearing back down the pass, leaving the blood-soaked ground behind him. Taza scrambled to Eleanor's side. He checked her frantically, his hands gentle as they ran over her arms, making sure she was unharmed. "I am all right," she assured him, her voice trembling. "Taza, you are safe." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him, his face buried in her hair. She could feel the tremors running through his massive frame, the aftermath of the brutal fight. Down below, Sheriff Brody was disarming the last of the posse, his face set with a grim new resolve. The reckoning at Apache Leap was over. Taza and Eleanor had survived. They stood together on the high rocks, bathed in the late afternoon sun, looking down not as fugitives, but as victors who had won their freedom, and each other with blood courage and an impossible love. And so the story of Taza and his Eastern bride became a legend. With Josiah Blackwood exiled, their tale became a whispered testament that the line between savage and civilized is drawn by the heart. Their journey reminds us that love can be found in the most unexpected places, and that true freedom isn't about escaping a cage, but having the courage to choose your own sky. It's a powerful reminder that even in the harshest of times, the human spirit's capacity for defiance and love can never be vanquished. If this story of the untamed West and an unbreakable bond moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with a fellow history lover. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the notifications bell. We have so many more tales from the past to share, and we wouldn't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.